Welcome to Whiskey Lore, The Interviews. I'm your host, Drew Hanisch, the Amazon bestselling author of Whiskey Lore's Travel Guide to Experiencing Kentucky Bourbon and the upcoming Experiencing Irish Whiskey book that is releasing on November the 22nd. And today, it is time to head to Scotland, and one of my favorite places on the island, the Kintyre Peninsula, and the town of Campbeltown. And we're going to visit with Melanie Stanger, who is involved in regional sales and brand ambassador for the world-famous Springbank Distillery. And I know this is one that a lot of my listeners will be very interested in hearing more about. It's a family distillery that thrived when Campbeltown was considered the whiskey capital of the world. And, of course, I did some episodes on that in the past on Whiskey Lore Stories. And we're going to talk about what happened with Springbank in terms of when it, how it came about, take it through the history, and talk about some of the brands, as well as doing a tasting of their flagship Springbank 10. So, Melanie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So, a lot of things to talk about here. This is one of those distilleries that I think stands out in the world of Scotch because you're family owned. Now this is one of those things where recently I've been sort of saying we shouldn't talk so much about firsts or onlys or that sort of thing, but because sometimes that's a little bit hard to define. But in terms of family owned distilleries, are you one of the only ones, or are you the only one?
No, there are a few.
Okay.
And there actually, in the past few years, there have been quite a few new distilleries starting up. And again, it sort of seems to be more sort of families, individuals who are involved in establishing these. Yeah,
it's that's the other difficulty with the whiskey world right now, is that you can say something now, but there are so many distilleries popping up all of a sudden that in fact, you are one of 3 distilleries in Campbeltown. Are there any new distilleries planned for Campbeltown at this point?
Yep, there are actually 3 in the pipeline.
Wow.
Yeah. So, and one of them is connected with Springbank and Glengyle.
Okay.
And then another one is out by Macrahanish near the airport, and it's actually, really fairly well established. They've bought their land, and I think they're ready to sort of cut the turf, as they say, next year in 2023. And then another one is they've got their plans in for a distillery actually in the town. So I'd say it's fairly optimistic that all these 3 in the pipeline will actually come to fruition. And if you visit Campbeltown in maybe 5 years' time, you might be able to say it's a town to 6 distilleries rather than the 3 that we have at the minute.
I would say that'd have to be great for you guys, because it really does put Campbeltown completely on the map, whereas now I think people go, oh, Campbeltown, yeah, that's a region in Scotland also, if they're not overly familiar with the regions, because you're kind of out of the way in terms of your location being on the Kintyre Peninsula.
Yeah, no, it's super. I mean, when you think, as we'll talk about later on, but, for a while there was only 1 working distillery in the town, although there was such a rich whisky heritage. And then it went up to 2, and then 3. And luckily with the 3rd one, it really sort of helped us re-establish its independent whisky region. Because before that, it was very much sort of really forgotten about. And so now having the 3 separate distilleries for the past, 20 odd years, it's really helped put it back in the map.
Yeah.
And then also just with more interest in whisky and more people travelling, and Islay becoming so popular, and lots of people, really enjoying that experience. So wanting to come back to Argyll, but maybe visit, another town where you have, not just 1 distillery, but several to visit. And so that's where Campbeltown's really coming into its own.
And this is what's interesting, is I've been so hyper-focused on Ireland over the last little while. But my trip to Northern Ireland was an eye-opener, because it really gave me this sense that, that there's this sort of friendly competition between Scotland and Ireland as to, who was the first to make whiskey. And I say down in Ireland, I think most people in Scotland will say, yes, it came up through Ireland, but, it wasn't really until, 1494 is the first record of, aqua vitae at that point, but being, a forerunner to whiskey at that particular point. But I did an episode not too long ago where I was digging into that relationship. Dalriada was the kingdom that not only Kintyre Peninsula was part of that, but also Northern Ireland was part of that. And the relationship between those, and you're actually, I would say you're probably closer to Ireland. Well, you're definitely closer to Ireland than you are to Glasgow.
Yes, we are. Yep, it'd be lovely if you could hop in a flight to go to shopping in Belfast.
Yeah.
What's one of my pet hates is if you're on the phone, trying to find where your nearest store is or whatever. Quite often, they discount the sea. And so more often than not, they'll say your nearest shop is whatever over in Northern Ireland, and you think, no, nobody can walk on water, or not yet. So yeah.
Google Maps a long time ago, back when they had a sense of humor, I did a road trip from Boston to London, and it actually said, drive into the water. I'm like, okay, that's interesting.
If you want to survive.
Yeah, not if you want to survive, or you have a James Bond car of some form. But that's an interesting thing to me, because my point to them historically in that research was that you guys are so closely related that it almost feels like Ireland and Scotland should just share the earliest records of whiskey, because we're not 100% sure who made the first, and it kind of evolved over time, and that whole idea of that relationship still, the feeling of the people seems to be the same between the two areas, Northern Ireland and Kintyre Peninsula.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities, and even this day, lots of people will travel between the two countries for studying or for work. I play golf down at Dunaverty, and on a lovely sunny day, you can look right over to Northern Ireland. And you can take some boats will go over between Campbeltown and Northern Ireland. So it's still very much a mix between the cultures.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about distilling in that area and this rise up to becoming the whiskey capital of the world. The town itself gets its name from the Campbells of Argyll, and interesting to note that the first man to mention aqua vitae in the area, Alex Campbell, in 1591, was. It's like everything you look at, you when you're doing a history search on the area, it's like there's a Campbell involved in everything in that area. Robert Burns' girlfriend was from there; she was a Campbell, and so talk a little bit about that. Where the town got its name from, and what you know of that development there.
Yeah, well, Campbell, as you're saying, is the family name of the Duke of Argyll, who's obviously the main landowner for this area of Scotland, and he was very influential in the Covenanters, and so he was very much wanting to encourage people who were in the lowlands to come over and settle in Campbeltown. And so he established Campbeltown in the early 1700s, with people moving across from Ayr and the Ayrshire coast, and very much looking for employment and wanting to improve their lives. And so that was really what caused the town to be created and for people to settle. And so you have, lots of family names that, are, have been here since then. And, people have obviously, almost 300 years on, settled very well and are happy and, have created a very good life down here. And a lot of it has been, in one way due to its geographical location. So before, it obviously would be like fishing, and then it eventually went into whiskey. And we sort of joke still nowadays, it's the 3 Fs. It's fishing, farming and forestry are the mainstay of the economy.
Okay. And I mean, this, there was a lot of barley being grown in that particular area, so I understand. And so that kind of helped feed this idea of doing whiskey, even though the area was somewhat religious from what I understand, and probably whiskey was not something that they overly promoted early on, but it just kind of evolved because of what they had around there.
Yeah, well, very much so. I mean, most of the people came over were, traditional farming background. And so, if they had any spare barley, beforehand, they would have used it to produce beer. And then when they had the technology and the knowledge, they used some spare, if there was any spare, to produce whiskey. And obviously it had a long shelf life. So although saying that, it was actually made one day, intended to be drunk the next. There wasn't anything like the maturation that we have nowadays.
Yeah, it's interesting to think we try to apply modern sensibilities to whiskey that was made back then, but really they didn't have the rules, and if they put it in the barrel, it was likely being put in the barrel just because they needed a place to keep it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there are some family names that come out that are the Campbells, of course, but then in the world of whiskey in Campbeltown, there were names like Greenlee, Coville, Ross, and Mitchell, and they really kind of dominated that whiskey scene. They would own multiple distilleries, and it seems like it kind of swapped them around a bit as well.
Yeah, and I mean, being a relatively small town, there was a lot of intermarriage as well. So, they were really all a very, very close-knit community.
And Springbank actually was not, because now we associate it with the Mitchell family, but it wasn't actually started by the Mitchell family, was it?
So it was started by the Reed family, who were in-laws. So one of the daughters from the Mitchell family had married into the Reed family. But the Mitchell family themselves, on the site where Springbank is, they had actually done illicit distillation. And so there was albeit illegal, but there was a family connection, with the site where Springbank was founded.
Yeah, everything really changed. I mean, prior to the Excise Act of 1823, I think Campbeltown Distillery was the only distillery in town, and it was sizable, but the rest of it was illicit from what I understand. Then it just exploded after that law changed, with a lot of distilleries coming in.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it was like £10 for a license or something like that, which obviously, sounds like pennies nowadays, but at that time I imagine was a significant investment. But it was obviously, in one way, it really helped the government gain a lot of tax because everybody became legal, rather than sort of trying to, produce it illicitly and, sell as little as possible.
Yeah. So the Mitchells actually got into legal distilling earlier than Springbank with Reclachen Distillery. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's right. Reclachen, which is where the co-op is nowadays.
Okay, and so that was Wiley Mitchell, I believe, right?
Yeah, I'll go with your superior knowledge in that. Yeah.
All my digging through, I laugh about this because when I went to Campbeltown, I went to the library and I pulled out a book on the distilling history, and we can go through Alfred Barnard's book and get a lot of what was going on during the second boom in Campbeltown, but during that initial boom, all of these different distilleries. I'm trying to write this episode, and I'm going, I can't figure this out. I had to create a spreadsheet, basically, of all the distilleries and say, okay, this one opened on such and such a year, and then it closed on this year, and then this one opened this year, and then it closed this year, and it changed ownership there. And it's like, it's when you're talking about what ended up being somewhere between 28 and 30 distilleries in an area, and you're trying to keep all of those in your head, and figure out all the family connections between each of them.
The family connections are very difficult because there wasn't much variety in first names.
Yeah.
And father and sons tended to have the same name, and then the grandson as well. So yeah.
The big challenge of
Yes.
researching old history, for sure, especially in Scotland and Ireland, because you will definitely run into a lot of the same first names over and over again.
Yes, and it could be the same writing but different pronunciation, or vice versa. So, and sometimes the person doing the census didn't have the best spelling. So yeah.
Yeah. So then we have the Reed brothers selling, and so John and William Mitchell were the ones that came in and brought. Were they brothers?
Yes, they were. Yeah.
Okay. And so with all of these distilleries going on here, the early years, is there much known about what type of whiskey? I mean, they were selling single malt, I'm guessing, up until around 1860 when the Spirits Act opened up blending. But would that have been, how much do you know about those early years of distilling there?
Well, I mean, there is, we've got some very small sort of a corner of the shop, which is a museum, and we have some old documents there. And one in particular would be of interest to you because it was for, I think, 120 gallons of whiskey that had been sold to a certain John Walker of Kilmarnock.
Ah, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So
I'd say that's the oldest one that I've seen here anyway.
Yeah. And really that's what helped Campbeltown get so big, I think, the second time. It's like the thing that I didn't understand about Campbeltown before I started researching it is you hear Campbeltown was the whiskey capital of the world, and then it just disappeared. And so you get in your mind this image of a town that boomed for like 6 or 7 years and then just crashed because it grew too fast. But that wasn't the case at all. It was a century at least where Campbeltown was a dominating force in the world of whiskey.
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean the population nowadays is about 6,000. The population, during the whiskey era was 12,000.
Wow.
So I mean, for that time, it was a really, considering its geographical location, it was booming. And with the distilleries, obviously, you need all the support trades as well. So you had all the coppersmiths, coopers, everybody had to be on site because, going for a short distance, 40 miles, it took you, 8 hours on your horse to get there. And even, if it was by boat was slightly more accessible because it was only 10 hours by boat from Campbeltown to Glasgow, which, in those days was, I think the second city of the empire. So you could hop on a ship and it would be going, all around the world. So in one way it was remote, but another way it was actually very well connected for that time.
Yeah.
When the sea was the motorway of nowadays.
And so once the Spirit Act came along and blending began, now we know one of the blends that that the whiskey went into. But what's interesting when I taste blends, Johnny Walker Black is an interesting one to mention because there's a little bit of a smoky character in there. So you taste it and you go, okay, I wonder where that is coming from, and all those different flavors that you're trying to blend together to make a whiskey. And so, and I've always heard that Campbeltown has a particular personality in terms of its whiskeys. What would you say that personality is? Is it like as a kind of a seaside character? Was it the peat that was used early on, or the type of barley?
Yeah, no, I'd say that, I mean, there's loads of different factors, you know. I mean, obviously the barley is important for flavour, but also fermentation. We have a really long, slow fruity fermentation. And then equally, you know, the distillation as well is very unique, being distilled 2.5 times. And then equally, I mean, all the maturation takes place in the town in Campbeltown. So the whole production process, A to Z, all happens in the same site. So the whisky is never actually, you know, talk about your food miles nowadays, but I mean, it's not travelling even probably a quarter of a mile in its lifetime from distillation to maturation to bottling, which makes it very special. And I think with the maturation, we're only about 300 metres from the sea. So definitely that would give you the lovely sort of saltiness, coastal notes that you recognise with the Springbank. But equally the peat, I mean, if you go back into, you know, 100, 150 years ago, the peat would have been locally dug from near the town. And so that would have given sort of, again, a sort of lovely smoky, but probably salty smoke. Again, just because of its location, being in a very narrow peninsula and very close to the sea as well. And just the fruitiness, you know, comes from all the lovely casks that we use, because we know that about 90% of the, 70% of the flavour comes from the cask. So, yeah, even in that time, although it wasn't a necessary requirement to mature for 3 years, most people did mature it because they recognised, you know, people wanted colour to their spirit, and they enjoyed the different flavours it offered as well.
This was a fun part about walking around doing the tour at the distillery. It is the most complete distillery tour in Scotland as far as my experience has been, in that you on the standard tour are basically getting to see everything from malting all the way through to bottling, which, I mean, it's interesting that those pieces are, the first and the last are missing from so many distilleries. I think there's only 7 distilleries right now that have malting floors, and not all of them run all the time. And yet with your distillery, you're able to move through the entire process. And we walked outside, and I saw a pile of peat sitting next to the door. It's like, okay, this is very real. It's all right here, and definitely easily accessible. It makes me wonder too about with the rise of Campbeltown and all the buildings that were through there, how much of the current structure of the Springbank distillery is from the original 1828 distillery?
Right, I mean, that's a very good question. I'm afraid I don't know. We think that most of the buildings were from maybe like 1850s, 1860s, and that would actually just have been like the external walls. I mean, the equipment was very much sort of revamped in the 1960s. And then really since then, you know, there's been a case of maintenance, but not really an installation of, you know, new pieces of equipment. And so for that reason, you know, lots of people call it a working museum. I've actually, you know, had people visiting from other distilleries, and at the end of the tour, they quite often say, right, you know, now show us where you really produce the whiskey. Because they can't believe that whiskey is still made, you know, as traditionally as it is at Springbank.
And then to walk in, and so you have 3 pot stills. Mm-hmm. Is that how? And you're doing 2.5 times. Now, I know you do a triple distilled as well, which is, I think, the Hazelburn, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and so there's part of me that's going, I wonder if it's 2.5. They decided on 2.5 times because they knew they were nestled so close to Ireland. They wanted to be the bridge between the two. With this distilling at 2.5 times, is that something that is historical. In other words, were they also distilling 2.5 times back in the 19th century?
I mean, nobody actually really knows the answer to that. We don't know if it was the case from 1828, or if somebody had an idea, later on. All we do know is that, we distill it 2.5 times and it works.
Okay.
And so, I mean, Mr. Wright is very much, why fix which isn't broken? So
Yeah.
we're going to continue with it because there's nothing, it's, if anything, it's enhancing the product.
So how do you technically get to 2.5 distillations with 3 pot stills?
So basically, from the first distillation, they collect the low wine and it goes to one tank, and then after the second distillation, you get your faints, and then in the tank they mix 20% of the low wine with 80% of the faints, and then once that's been combined, that then pours into the final still. And so after the final distillation, some of the liquid's been distilled twice and some thrice. So we get to an average of being distilled 2.5 times. Okay.
That works. Creative math. Yours isn't as complicated as Mortlock. Mortlock is like, it's like 2 point something or other times distilled. It's like, how did you figure all that out? And then you see the calculations and you're going, okay, because they have the world's smallest, or they have Scotland's smallest still, I think, and that's why they suggest that.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. So, so as we move along through history, there was a second boom. That second boom was followed by it was sort of a slow decline, I guess. I mean, it was basically after the Pattison crash at the end of the 19th century, and all of a sudden the DCL was going around buying up every distillery they could get their hands on and then shutting them down. So I think that was part of what really knocked out the distilleries in Campbeltown. But there were some cases where, like the Glengyle distillery, and actually that's kind of an interesting story. I don't know how much of that you know, but Glengyle distillery seems to have evolved out of a family dispute at Springbank.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the two brothers that we mentioned earlier, John and William, worked very well at Springbank together for many years. And then they were both farmers, and unfortunately had an argument over some sheep, and it escalated, and it actually ended their business relationship. And so John, being the elder brother, he kept Springbank, and then William, being the younger brother, thought, you know what, I still want to produce whiskey. I'm going to set up on my own. So he bought land bordering onto Springbank and built himself a distillery, Glengyle.
Very nice.
And it was a working distillery for almost 50 years until longer than that, until the 1930s. And it was actually one of the few, the first distillery in Campbeltown, where William's daughter, she actually ran it for a while. She ran Muirclachan, which is next door to Glengyle, for I think a short while in the 1930s.
Okay. It's all three, I mean, all Mitchell distilleries then, all kind of in a row with each other down through there. Yeah,
and I mean, the nice thing is that if you go to the co-op, the address of the co-op is still the name of the distillery. It's still Muirclachan.
Oh, wow.
So the name does still exist.
You see, now after doing all my research, I need to come back again and just stroll around town again and catch these names that I did all the research on and kind of spot stuff like that. That's fun. It's like walking around a town that's a museum, although it's kind of a museum that has the museum pieces have disappeared.
Yeah, it's very much just like any city, really. You've just got to take your time and look up. And I mean, you can be walking anywhere and then you realize, it might be a coke station nowadays, but it was built as a distillery.
So then but the interesting thing about another distillery, which was Hazelburn, which is a name that's related to your whiskey, is that it seems that during the war there were some people coming in trying to buy up some of the Campbeltown distilleries to try to survive. And Peter Mackey, who's one of the very colorful figures, who was on Isla and had gotten in the dispute between Lefroy and Lagavulin, came in and bought Hazelburn to try to save it, but then ended up, his son died in the war. And it was kind of, to me, it kind of shows how World War I was really kind of the death knell for Campbeltown, because what it did was it took so many of the distillers away. It took so many of the people who worked in the industry away, and that it was significant on top of the fact that there was this suggestion that Campbeltown whiskey was dropping in quality because they were just trying to push out as much whiskey as they had. All this whiskey in the warehouse, and they were just trying to push whatever they could out, and blenders weren't quite as interested in it as they were in the past.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's interesting what you say about the First World War, because William Mitchell's son actually died in the closing months of the First World War. He was in the RFC, so what eventually became the Royal Air Force, and he actually died just a few months after turning 18. And so you can see why he'd obviously hoped to pass the distillery on, so maybe that's again one reason why he sold in the mid-20s, being I think he was in his 70s by then, and maybe was questioning where's the future here, when he was just looking at, you say, the reputation of Campbeltown wasn't good at that time. And the problem is with whiskey, with all the new regulations, was that it was no longer possible to make whiskey and sell it the next day. You were having to produce it and wait for 3 years before you got a return on your money, which at that time, you'd no guarantee that who you were planning to sell your whiskey would be there in 3 years, or and so you'd no guarantee that you would actually earn that money back. So it was a challenge. They've gone a bit perfect storm now after COVID, but it was definitely a perfect storm, in the era of the 1920s, due to just the First World War, the loss of life, the economic problems, and then coming up towards the end of the 20s with the Depression, and also Prohibition. And so it was a very, very difficult time. And if you didn't have that reputation either for the quality, that was definitely another issue as well for Campbeltown.
Yeah.
And equally, we were sort of discussing transport links earlier on, and one of the reasons that Speyside took off in the late 19th century was because of rail. And Campbeltown to this day, our nearest railway station is Aracher, which is half an hour, 40 minutes outside of Glasgow. So that development in transport just really never helped Campbeltown. And it was still in the 1920s, the 1820s, it's by sea. It still took more or less 8 to 10 hours to transport goods, and so that part of the equation had never changed.
And so once we get up to the point where all of these distilleries have died out now, and there's just 3 left, and of the 3 left, 2 of them were they still Mitchell owned? Was Springbank and Reclacken, were those still under the Mitchells at that point?
So the Mitchells, they owned Reclacken till I think the 1930s when it was sold. And William Mitchell owned Glengyle until he sold it in, I think, 1925.
Yeah, and then those 2, Reclacken took the longest to shut down. Actually, Springbank, as I understand, in the late 20s also was either mothballed for a little while, or something like that occurred, that it was off the map for just a short period of time.
Yeah.
And then for the longest time, Glen Scotia, it's so funny because when I was talking to Ian McAllister about it, we talk about the fact that Glen Scotia's reputation really wasn't great over that time period. It wasn't until he came in really towards after the first or during the first decade of the 21st century that they started looking at the equipment and saying, wait, maybe we need to do something a little bit different here to improve our quality. And so, but yet they held on through all those years, and Springbank held on through all those years, even through the 1980s when we were in somewhat of a whiskey depression, I think you could call it. What do you think is the reason that Springbank was the one that was able to keep the quality up and survive so long in that area?
Well, I think Mr. Wright inherited the distillery in the 1960s, and he was a younger son, so he'd never expected, to be in that position. And unfortunately, his brother predeceased him, but also, died far younger than expected. And then, in fairly quick succession, his father died, and his father actually said to him, you should sell. But he thought, no, I'm going to give it a shot. And so for the first 10 years, he actually commuted between St Andrews and Campbeltown, every weekend.
Wow.
And so it was very much it wasn't his focus; it was his sideline. And then just luckily, he decided, no, this is worthwhile, and he actually, after 10 years, moved to Campbeltown. And there's been somebody sort of steadying the ship and guiding the distillery, through all these decades since then. And that's definitely helped put it on a very sure footing that we're very lucky to the luxury of nowadays. But as we were saying earlier, it obviously causes its own problems as well.
So when he would have introduced, I guess it was in the early 70s, when a second brand came out, the Longrow, which is your peated expression. But help me sort of understand this. There is an element of peat in Springbank too, is there not?
Yeah, so Springbank just is a very sort of a suggestion of peat. So we're talking, it's just about 6 hours in peat smoke. So about 12 to 15 ppm.
Okay.
So for some, you usually tend to get it, a wee bit in the nose and then more in the finish. It's just another interesting dimension to the whiskey itself.
Yeah. Was it still being used for blends at that time, or was it being sold as a single malt? Because I know single malt its return is more recent than we really would imagine it to be.
I think for Springbank, the malts have tended to be a focus in the recent history anyway. There's been Campbeltown Loch, which is a blend that a lot of people associate with, Springbank, and that sort of had a bit of a rebirth recently with a vatted malt, whereas before it was a blended whiskey. So we've now gone on to a blended malt, and it's a really good whiskey for an introduction to the town, because it's got whiskies from all the 5 single malts from the 3 distilleries in the town.
Oh, okay. Very interesting. I love that community share in doing that and bringing together all the whiskey distilleries for something like that.
Yeah, Campbeltown Loch is so well known. And so, there's a very famous song in Scotland and actually worldwide by Andy Stewart, and it's Campbeltown Loch, I Wish You Were Whiskey. If you haven't heard it, just go onto YouTube, and it's very, very popular, very funny.
Very nice. I'll have another song I have to throw in with Paul McCartney now, Mull and Kintyre, because I always make the mistake of, because I'm so used to saying Mull of with Kintyre, that whenever I try to say Kintyre Peninsula, I always want to start off with Mull.
Right.
And that's just a spot on the peninsula. That's not the whole peninsula.
Yeah, And it's quite an interesting road to get there as well.
Is it?
Yeah, it takes a long time to get there.
Oh man.
Yeah.
So one of the whiskeys that you have as well as the Long Row is the explain the relationship between the Glengyle Distillery and Springbank, because when I went there to tour, they are two separate tours. You go to Kilkerran like it is its own distillery, but you just walk seamlessly from one distillery to the next. And so talk a little bit about your relationship with Glengyle and how that distillery came about.
So, first of all, it's the same production team. So it's the same guys who produce whiskey at Springbank Distillery, also produce whiskey at Glengyle Distillery, but two very different styles. So as we were saying, Springbank Distillery is a very labour-intensive production, whereas at Glengyle, it's not quite sitting down in a comfy chair and pressing a button on a computer screen, but it's relatively more modern than Springbank. And the two distilleries are, with obviously a similar production team, they're also similar, very strong ties at the start and the end of the production process. So the barley that's used at Glengyle Distillery is malted at Springbank on the traditional floor malting. And then the barley, once it's been malted, it goes up to Glengyle, which is where it's then milled, fermented, distilled, etc., put into casks. And then in the warehouses that surround the path between these two distilleries, there's different whiskies and different ages are all mixed up across different warehouses. And so the maturation, you could have a Springbank maturing side by side to a Kilkerran whiskey. So it's all very much higgledy-piggledy.
Do you guys offer a tour that goes and does both distilleries, or it's you try to remain independent on that end?
I think we're very much still separate. So you can do both tours, but they're both at separate start times and end times.
Yeah, very nice. And the whiskey because people may go Glengyle, I'm not familiar with that, but they've probably seen Kilkerran, which is the name of the whiskey. Was there a reason for going with a different whiskey name than from the distillery name?
Yeah, so when Mr. Wright purchased the building in 2000, when the distillery had initially been closed in 1925, everything had been sold, even the name of the whiskey. So it was very much just the building that he purchased. None of the equipment was left, and also the brand Glengyle had been bought by another company, and it was actually a blended whiskey at that time. It was called Glengyle. And so that company, the name was offered to Mr. Wright when he purchased Glengyle Distillery, but for a rather inflated price. And so he may be a wealthy man, but he said thanks but no thanks. And so they came up with the name of Kilkerran for the whiskey, because it's the English version of the Gaelic name for Campbeltown.
Okay. I was going to say, during my research, plus Saint Karen was the one who had come over. I guess he was... it was considered that he was taught by St. Patrick. Of course, when you're talking about Irish history, it seems that St. Patrick lived for centuries and seemed to travel to every single step. He stepped foot on every single piece of the Emerald Isle. But it's interesting to see how his name is attached, and kind of the idea that St. Karen came over and that his name was associated with the region as well, or with the town. So
Yeah, so Kilkerran is basically, well, I believe it's like Kil is for mount, and so it's St Kieran's Mount.
okay,
And actually, when you're in Campbeltown, the road out to the graveyard is called Kilkerran Road.
okay,
Um, so yeah, so
nice.
I don't know if you want to name a whiskey after a road to a graveyard,
A
but
graveyard, yeah.
that's what's happened. Yeah,
It has enough other history along with it.
yeah,
I think there's
definitely.
a Kilkerran Castle as well. That I think there are remnants of that castle that still remain north of town.
Yep, they're also like the name Kilkerran appears quite a bit over in the Ayrshire coast, which we were talking earlier about the settlers coming in from Ayrshire. So there's another sort of link between different parts of Scotland that were separated by the sea.
Mm. And then when we talk about basically the flavor profiles now, if we kind of move over, well, actually, first I want to talk about you guys have a really big fan, and this big fan is somebody who has a lot of influence. Because when I started learning more about Scotch whiskey, I was paying attention to this guy, and his last name I think is also Mitchell, Ralphie Mitchell, who does all
Oh yeah.
the video tastings. He is really a great promoter of yours. Is that I wonder, because in these days there are so many distilleries, new distilleries that are starting up that are seeking out people to promote their whiskeys. How does it feel to have someone just like latch on to you like that? I take it he's been down there a couple of times and probably done some behind the scenes tours with you guys also.
Yeah, no, I mean we're delighted that people love Springbank so much, and what's nice is that it's the whiskey that does the talking.
Yeah, yeah. I What's interesting is I sampled it while I was there, but the thing is that when you're on a tour, we got to taste I think Springbank 10, then the Hazelburn, and the Long Row. But sometimes when you're on a tour, and it was still in my early days of doing tastings, that you kind of go, yeah, that's good, but I can't put my finger on what it is that is going to make me want to go buy that bottle. But I was in Nashville, Tennessee with a friend of mine, and we were at a whiskey bar, and they, I looked down the list and I went, you know what? I need to sample some Springbank. And so it was 12 year, and they poured the glass, and I pulled it to my nose. And normally this happens with smoky whiskeys for me, but where you stick your nose in the glass and you just don't want to pull your nose out of it. In fact, I've had times where I've sat there for 20 minutes not wanting to take a sip of the whiskey because I'm enjoying the smell of the whiskey so much that I'm afraid I'm going to spoil it if the taste doesn't quite match up to the experience I'm getting on the nose. And that's what happened when I was in Nashville. I didn't realize that 12 was a cask strength, and the bartender came over, and when she poured it, she said, "Oh, this is the last of the bottles. So I'll pour that, and you can just finish that, and I'll go crack a new bottle, bring it over, and pour you another." And so I thought, well, this would be a fun time to do a little experiment and just see if the last out of the bottle is similar to the first out of the bottle, or if there's a difference. And it didn't matter. Either one, I couldn't get my nose out of the glass because I so enjoyed that orchard fruit, the citrus that comes through. To me, it's almost like an orange creamsicle kind of a smell that comes out of it that takes me back to when I was a kid. And so it was so fun to nose that and enjoy it that much. And then I decided that I wanted to go get a bottle of the cask strength 12 year. And that's when I found out that Springbank is very hard to find. It used to be that if I went to my local Total Wine, that it was always sitting there on the shelf, and you could, it was always saying, "Here I am," and I always kind of walked past. But now that I really want it, I ended up going up to Kentucky, because I joke with people that I go to Kentucky to buy scotch, because they're an open state, so you can get a lot more there. But when I walked into the store, I saw a bottle of Springbank 10, and they wanted $120 for it. And I went, I know it's not a $120 whiskey, but I better buy it, because I haven't seen it anywhere else. And then, of course, for the rest of my trip, everywhere I went, I saw a bottle of $99 Springbank 10 on the shelf where I went. But this is one of those things that, when I went to Ireland, I specifically looked for Springbank to bring back with me at a whiskey shop that had scotch in Dublin. And they said, we just can't get it. So we have this with Buffalo Trace here in the U.S., but this concept of allocation, and what are the reasons why it's so hard to find a bottle of Springbank these days?
Well, just unfortunately, 10, 15, 20 years ago, nobody had a crystal ball. And so no one thought this whiskey boom that's really been going on since the 1990s would continue so long. Mm. And, just it's an actually sort of cycle. So everybody's expecting it to have a downturn sometime. But also another sort of wee quirk has been COVID. And definitely we noticed a change, during COVID, where people had, just more money to spend on, higher end products, and definitely whiskey was one of the winners of that. Yeah.
So basically it's just, because I'm hearing all sorts of things like getting bottles is difficult for a lot of distillers, getting barrels is tough for a lot of distillers. But if you think about the barrel issue, that's not something that you're really going to realize until years from now, when that whiskey has had time to age. There's stuff that should already be aging out there, but have any of these other supply chain kind of issues also fed into the problems of getting whiskey out there?
I would say, for us, it's maybe just sort of delayed. Say, like, as you say, there was a problem with glass, problem with corks, but we've just been these have been minor delays, I would say. As far as I'm aware, what we've planned to bottle, since, we all sort of returned to work in July 2021, has been able to take place.
Yeah. So do you feel like... Are you guys doing like a lot of other distilleries are, and taking this opportunity to kind of ramp up, or are you being semi-cautious about it, that we know whiskey goes through these ebbs and flows and is very popular, then it kind of wanes for a little while, and then it comes back?
Well, the maltings are basically in use as much as possible, 12 months a year, give or take, the 2-week shutdown in between Christmas and New Year. So if we want to continue, having our handmade whiskey, that's pretty key, is to, retain our 100% malting. And so we're not going to be able to increase production, unless we adapt that. And Mr. Wright is very, for him, the standard is handmade whiskey. And so in the past few years, to help with that, we've, got a new bottling line, we've got a couple of new warehouses, and so the next stage we'll be looking at possible, malting facilities on site for, say, Glengyle, because that will then free up, to malt all the barley for Springbank, and even more barley at Springbank, which will then enable us to increase production. Because the minute Springbank production's probably about 9 months of the year.
Yeah.
So straight away you can increase that significantly by solving the malting issue.
I hadn't really thought about that. That makes a lot of sense because these other distilleries can just go out and buy more and buy more and buy more. They don't have to have that lag time where you have to basically wait for the malting process to be completed so that you have barley to work with.
Mm. Yeah.
To wait too long to close things out. So let's go ahead and do I'm going to do a little nosing and tasting on this and talk about it. But tell me about the barrels that you use for Springbank 10, especially. Are you doing? I know you use sherry barrels and you use bourbon barrels. Is it a mixture of like Oloroso, PX? What kind of sherry barrels do you use for your whiskey?
Yeah, so for the Springbank 10, it has sort of a general recipe the production guys will follow, although they'll tweak if required. So it's usually 60% bourbon casks
Mm-hmm.
and then 40% sherry casks. And the sherry will mainly be Oloroso.
Okay. I wondered with all the brightness in this, because I get like vanilla, I get the honey. I take it that's kind of likely coming from the bourbon barrel, but then the orchard fruits seem a little brighter to me than I usually think. Oloroso is like your raisins and plums and figs and that sort of thing. So it's an interesting balance.
I think sometimes from the bourbon cask you can definitely get lovely apples coming through. A bit of zestiness too.
Yeah, and there's a nice little spicy character on this. I'm going to start looking for that peat note a little bit more, that smoke note, because I think it comes in on the finish, but the way that it comes in, it's very subtle, and it just kind of changes the sweetness kind of dries out towards the end, and I think maybe that's what that is that smoke influence, and I'm just not picking that out.
Yeah, no, I think, if the fact it's such a short time, the barley is dried in the peat smoke, we're not going for, a heavy peat influence. We're just basically aiming for it to have a nice sort of twist, to look for another dimension, to the whiskey itself.
Well, Melanie, thank you so much for taking us through and talking a little bit about the history, going through the history of Campbeltown and of Springbank to kind of add to our knowledge of the one distillery that really kind of hung in there through the whole thing, and kept the quality up and kept the faith for Campbeltown fans through the years, and for introducing us to some of the different brands as well. I thank you, and I wish you guys a lot of luck, and I guess we will continue to kind of seek out those bottles as we can, and appreciate the fact that you guys are trying to stay true to your mission of creating an honest whiskey from front to back, 100% in-house.
Yeah, that's very important. So, we are obviously looking at, we're not happy that people can't buy it. So we are definitely looking at, improving the production and increasing production. But obviously, as we know, whiskey isn't a quick game.
Yeah.
So we're just going to have to be patient and, wait for a number of years before it becomes available.
Well, I wish you best of luck, and I will keep seeking out the Springbank on my shelf. Cheers.
Yeah, enjoy.